Joining us right now, Daniel Hannan. I saw him speak earlier this year at an event promoting his book, Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. I have the book. I've read the book. It is a brilliant book. Everyone will love this book. If you love this country, if you love freedom, you must get this book. And it struck me as I heard you speaking, Daniel Hannan, that the most articulate promoter of American ideals, American freedom, American exceptionalism came from you, a Brit, Daniel Hannan. Am I being too American by saying that it is American exceptionalism? Or do we have to share this exceptionalism with you Brits who do everything right?
Well, you're certainly being American in how generously you introduce me. I'm not going to be able to follow or live up to that wonderful way in which you've extolled my virtues. But, I mean, I would say there is a continuum, isn't there? Americans tend to define American exceptionalism in much the same way that we do. It resides in institutions like personal freedom and free contract and regular elections and jury trials and habeas corpus and so on. And the reason that that continuum is there is not because of some accident, not because of some parallel evolution, but because the founders of the American Republic, far-sighted patriots as they were, saw themselves not as innovators, but as conservatives. They believed that they were asserting the patrimony that had been theirs as Englishmen. And they took it in the old courthouse at Philadelphia to a higher and more sublime form than had ever been encoded in the old country, which is why all English speakers have an interest in the fortunes of your republic, and your welfare is important to all of us.
Well, and to that end, and speaking of that continuum, there's one story that has stayed with me all year long since I heard you speak, and that was the story, especially it's so relevant here on Christmas Eve, about the August 1941 meeting between FDR and Winston Churchill on the deck of the HMS Prince of Wales. This is just on the eve of Winston Churchill trying to get the American president to commit to the conflict in Europe. Please tell that story and why it's so significant to our two countries.
Churchill was determined to show the real affinity between the American and British cultures. He didn't just see it as a coincidence that we were both democracies. He wanted to show that there was a wider consanguinity on which it rested. It happened to be a Sunday morning, and he had the crews of the two vessels, the USS Augusta, which had carried Franklin Roosevelt, and HMS Prince of Wales, on which he'd come to Newfoundland. He had them paraded for a joint religious service, and he'd chosen every detail personally and meticulously, down to the hymns that they sang, down to the reading from the chaplain, which was from Joshua 1. As I was with Moses, so shall I be with thee. I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage. And afterwards, ecstatically, the Prime Minister said, the same language, the same hymns, the same ideals. And the point, when he said the same ideals, he wasn't making some bland generalization about being the good guys. If you look at the world as it stood in August 1941, all of the things that we now take for granted, democracy, freedom, uncensored newspapers, equality between men and women, the rule of law, those things were pretty much confined to the Anglosphere, to the community of English-speaking nations. The whole of the Eurasian landmass was under some form or other of autocracy. And when we now talk about the spread of these values, the ideals of what we loosely call Western civilization, what we really mean, if we're being honest, is that these were the values of the Anglo-American system of government, and the reason that they became Western values, the reason that we now sometimes think of them as almost universal values, frankly, was because of a series of military victories by the English-speaking peoples.
You know, Daniel, in your book you speak about the story of liberty and the landmark victories that contributed to that. And I'm wondering, how did America evolve into the state where, as you say in your book, a lot of these fantastic ideas, founding ideas, are abandoned and scorned? How did America get to the place where we are almost fearful of these traditional values?
It's a quite recent thing, the idea that they're scorned. I mean, there is a tendency everywhere towards big government, and oligarchy and big government are, if you like, the normal lot of humanity. But what's a very recent thing in the West and in the Anglo-American system particularly is the academic relativism, the idea that there is nothing special about the ideals of the founders, that they are a group of dead white European males, and that, you know, the Arapaho have just as valid a story, and that, you know, the U.S. owes as much to them as it does to Jefferson or Franklin.
Yes.
That was an idea which was seen as a funny, laughable academic thesis 40 years ago, but it's now kind of just spread. There's an assumption in mainstream culture now that if you hold up the exceptionalism of the American story. If you say this country has brought freedom and happiness to hundreds of millions of people and has spread those ideals around the world and has attracted millions of settlers and turned them into American patriots because of the attractiveness of the ideal, that somehow you're being chauvinist or racist and it's not quite the right thing. You know, it's a really bizarre idea, and I'm sure our grandchildren will find it hilarious when they look back on our generation to think that we were so nervous about saying, you know, our system has been a better and surer vessel for freedom and happiness than has the civilization of, you know, Ethiopia or Japan or Russia.
Yeah, in this multicultural world, you're not allowed to say that we may have done something better. But his book, Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World, certainly makes that case. Daniel Hannan, I wonder, as we talk about how these things are in jeopardy right now, we have to talk about the relationship between our two countries, always referred to as the special relationship. And many people here on this side of the Atlantic were concerned at the president sort of changing that relationship. It sure seemed like our president changed that relationship right at the onset with some of the stories you heard about his relationship with your country, with sending back the bust of Winston Churchill. How are we seen in England now? I know a lot of people weren't happy with the previous president, George Bush. Are they happy with this president?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I mean, a lot of people on both sides of the Atlantic were, of course, unhappy with George Bush. I have to say that purely from a UK point of view, he always did the right thing by us. And although if I were an American, I would have plenty of criticisms of his domestic policy, his enlargement of the state, and so on. From the point of view of a traditional friend of the U.S., he knew who his allies were. He never forgot it. I don't think we do have that feeling with the current president. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that there has never been a worse time to be a traditional U.S. ally than now. The countries that are in their marrow pro-American, in their outlook, in their instincts, have tended to be badly treated. I'm not just talking about Britain. And by the way, the Churchill bust is a symbol. I mean, there are much more serious things like the way in which the current regime has lined up with autocratic Argentina on the issue of the Falklands. But, you know, the Polish and Czech governments, which had invested a huge amount of political capital in the missile defense system that was then scrapped almost as the first act of the incoming Obama regime. The Indians, who, one of the great acts of farsightedness and statesmanship for which George W. Bush will eventually be recognized, was bringing India back into the Anglosphere politically. They now have been disregarded and ignored. I mean,
Daniel Hannan, can you give me a quick Christmas present and stay with us? I need to break to traffic, but I'd love to keep you over.
Yeah, of course, with pleasure.
See, that's all I ever wanted for Christmas from Daniel Hannan. All right, Daniel Hannan is going to stay with us in just a moment. Jennifer, all yours.
Yes, indeed. Daniel, I have to ask you, I looked at your blog at the Daily Telegraph, and I saw something that charmed me greatly, and it was 10 reasons to be optimistic about 2014. My question to you is, this is a wonderful kind of a Reagan-esque sentiment, and is that type of thinking still vital to those who seek to be worthy conservatives?
That's a really good question, Jennifer. I sometimes think that pessimism is part of the conservative temperament. I find myself speaking to conservative audiences on both sides of the Atlantic, and people are angry. And I understand why conservatives are angry. From a conservative point of view, there are lots of things to be angry about. You know, the debt, the way in which our values are derided and traduced, and our patriotism is scorned, and the way our children and grandchildren are being disinherited. There are lots of things to be angry about. But when we are only angry, we come across as curmudgeonly. And what Ronald Reagan taught is that we are at our most persuasive and convincing and at our most electorally successful when we imbue our message with a little breath of warmth, a little hint of optimism, a promise that the best is yet to come. And, you know, the best has always lain ahead. I mean, you know, if I now say a generation from now, Americans will be wealthier and happier and leading more fulfilled and longer lives than ever before, an awful lot of your listeners will immediately say, oh, come on, what about the debt and so on. That sentence could have been spoken at any time since the Mayflower landed. It would have always been true, and it would have always had people saying, oh, rubbish. You know, you'd have had those 18th century guys with their breeches and their long coats saying, oh, no, it's all been fine up until now. It's all about to come to an end. There is a limitless ingenuity in the human spirit. You know, natural resources may be finite, but human inventiveness is not. And the private sector will always outgrow the state. That's my root cause for fundamental optimism.
Daniel Hannan, looking back at 2013, we had the passing of two major world figures. Most recently, of course, Nelson Mandela, and our president made worldwide headlines taking a selfie with your prime minister. Thanks for getting us into trouble there. I think it was Brown's fault, actually. Maybe his idea.
I was actually the prime minister of Denmark. She was sitting.
She was the one who instigated the whole thing. All right, then I blame her. It's always the Danes, isn't it?
It's not always the Danes, but I think they have. She's had a lot more criticism than either your guy or us.
Well, however, there is plenty of criticism on this side of the Atlantic about the fact that the president didn't make a showing at the other major death of a world leader, your Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who passed in April of last year. Not only did the president not go, but no one from the administration showed up at that funeral. Was there some grumbling about that, especially in light of the big show that was made for Nelson Mandela's funeral?
People don't really grumble about funerals, but I think it was noticed. It was surprising that there wasn't a single representative of the administration. The U.S. was well represented there, but it was represented with figures of the Reagan era, if I can put it that way. And in a way, that was perfectly apt. You know, there was an incredibly strong friendship between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and it was personal as well as political. He chivalrously allowed her to browbeat him on a number of issues, and it, you know, and it was a good thing for the world that he did. Actually, it was one of the issues that she was absolutely insistent on was the deployment of medium-range missiles in Europe, and it was because she got her way on that we hastened the liberation of hundreds of millions of people from communism. But, you know, that, again, I suppose that the Thatcher-Reagan partnership is a reminder of how much the world owes to the alliance of the English-speaking peoples. You know, the Anglo-Saxon world in arms is a pretty awesome force, and it has been a force for freedom. You know, it's not because we've been perfect. Your country, like mine, has made mistakes. It's had its imperfections. But you find me another civilization that has done more for human happiness and contentment than ours has.
It's so good to hear that, because I almost feel, you know, I'm ready for someone to call in and yell from the left that we're being, you know, patriarchal and sexist and racist for saying such a thing. But it's hard to dispute the facts, and those facts are all found in Daniel Hannan's book, Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. One last exit question, Daniel Hannan. You keep an eye on Washington, D.C. and American politics. Is there anybody on the horizon, a personality that you like in our political scene right now that sort of gives you hope to restore some of the ideals that you like to champion?
Oh, I mean, there are loads. I've never bought the idea that there is any kind of dearth of conservative talent. I'm a huge fan of what Rick Scott has achieved in his state. I'm always uplifted when I listen to Ted Cruz speaking, to Rand Paul. In a very different way, I was impressed by Chris Christie as someone who gets things done. I think there is a great wealth of talent on the Republican side of the aisle, and you know, it's a good position to be in when you're spoiled for choice like that. I wish you every success with it.
Thank you, Daniel Hannan, and we wish you a very Merry Christmas.
Merry
and of
Christmas
course,
to you, Larry.
Success on your end of the ocean as well. Always great to have you. Please don't be a stranger.